After 30 years in law enforcement, my husband David retired, longing for a quieter life. He wanted to leave the chaos of the city behind, so we bought a cabin deep in the forest of northern Maine. The cabin was a modest, two-bedroom structure nestled among tall pines and surrounded by miles of unspoiled wilderness. It was isolated, but that's what we wanted: peace, quiet, and the chance to reconnect with nature. David always had a calm demeanor, a trait that served him well in his years as a police officer. But the transition to retirement had been rocky. He was restless, always looking for something to do. I thought the cabin would give him purpose, something to fix or improve. And at first, it did. He spent weeks chopping wood, repairing the deck, and clearing the overgrown trails around the property. Winter came quickly in the forest. The snow arrived in mid-November, covering everything in a pristine white blanket. It was beautiful, but the isolation became more profound. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, and the nearest town, Ridgewood, was a 30-minute drive on winding, snow-covered roads. David didn't seem to mind. He thrived in the solitude, spending hours hiking in the woods or tinkering in the shed. I, however, found the quiet unnerving. The long nights were the worst. Without city lights, the darkness was impenetrable, and the forest came alive with sounds I couldn't identify. One night in early December, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't the usual creaking of trees or the distant call of an owl. This was closer, a sharp, deliberate sound like wood snapping. I nudged David awake, but he dismissed it as a deer or maybe a falling branch. He told me to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow outside the cabin. They were human, large, booted prints, and they circled the house. David examined them but didn't seem concerned. "Could be a hunter who got lost," he said. But something about the way the prints lingered near the windows unsettled me. David set up a trail camera that afternoon. He mounted it on a tree facing the front of the cabin, where the tracks had been. He said it was just for peace of mind, but I could tell he was uneasy too. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the cabin set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the sound of snapping wood. This time, it was followed by faint footsteps on the porch. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen in bed. The footsteps stopped, and then there was silence. The next morning, David checked the trail camera. The screen was blank. Someone had disabled it, cutting the straps and smashing the lens. David didn't say much, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He spent the day fortifying the cabin, securing the doors and windows and setting up makeshift alarms using fishing line and empty cans. He also brought his rifle out from storage, loading it and keeping it within reach. I asked if we should leave, but he shook his head. "This is our home," he said. "I'm not running because of some punk trying to scare us." The following night was eerily quiet. I lay in bed, listening for any sign of movement. Around midnight, I heard a soft thud, followed by the faint sound of metal scraping against metal. It was coming from the shed. David grabbed his rifle and a flashlight, motioning for me to stay inside. I watched from the window as he made his way to the shed. His breath formed clouds in the cold air, and the beam of his flashlight wavered as he approached. He opened the door and disappeared inside. For a few agonizing moments, there was silence. Then I heard a shout, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. David emerged, dragging a man by the collar of his jacket. The intruder was wiry, dressed in layers of dirty clothing, and his face was gaunt. David forced him to the ground and kept the rifle trained on him while calling the sheriff's office. The man didn't say a word, just stared at us with hollow eyes. When the deputy arrived, we learned the intruder had been living in the woods for years, surviving off stolen supplies and scavenging. He had a long history of mental illness and violent behavior. The deputy assured us the man would be taken into custody and evaluated, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even after the man was gone, I felt his presence lingering in the forest. David tried to reassure me, but the experience changed something in both of us. He was more vigilant, always checking the locks and scanning the tree line, and I found myself jumping at every sound, every shadow that moved outside. Winter passed, but the unease remained. The forest, once a place of peace and beauty, now felt like a prison. We eventually decided to sell the cabin and move back to the city. To this day, I can't walk in the woods without looking over my shoulder. The isolation I once craved now fills me with dread. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howls outside, I think of that man, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. I was 28 when I got the idea to build a small cabin in the middle of nowhere with a few friends. It wasn't some trendy getaway for Instagram photos. It was supposed to be a functional, no-frills shelter for weekend trips, hunting, and maybe just a place to escape. The idea came up during a late-night bonfire at my buddy Eric's house. By the next morning, 4 of us, me, Eric, Dave, and Jake, had committed to making it happen. We picked a spot deep in the Adirondacks, miles off any official trail. Eric had a cousin who owned land out there and said we could use a section of it. The land was wild and isolated, perfect for what we wanted. We spent weeks preparing, gathering tools, picking up lumber, and studying basic construction techniques online. None of us were builders, but we figured we could manage something small and sturdy enough to keep us dry and warm. It was late October when we finally set out. The air was crisp, and the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and orange. We packed everything into 2 trucks and drove as far as the logging roads would take us. From there, it was a 3-mile hike with all our gear loaded onto makeshift sleds and backpacks. It took us the better part of a day just to get to the spot we'd marked on a map. The first thing that struck me was the quiet. No hum of distant highways, no planes overhead, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. Just silence, thick and heavy. It felt like stepping into another world, one untouched by time. We pitched tents and spent the first night sitting around a fire, mapping out the next few days. The plan was simple: clear a space, lay a foundation, and get the walls up. We knew we couldn't finish it in one trip, but we wanted to make as much progress as possible before the weather turned. The next morning, we got to work. The spot we'd chosen was slightly elevated, with a stream nearby for water. We cleared brush, leveled the ground, and started digging holes for the foundation posts. The work was exhausting, but there was something satisfying about it. We were building something with our own hands, far from the noise and clutter of everyday life. By the end of the second day, we had the posts in place and had started framing the walls. The cabin was small, about 12 by 16 feet, but it was enough for what we needed. We worked from dawn until dusk, pausing only to eat or sharpen our tools. At night, we sat around the fire, sore and tired but proud of what we'd accomplished. It wasn't until the third day that things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. A branch snapping in the distance, a faint rustling in the underbrush. We shrugged it off as deer or maybe a black bear. This was their territory after all. But as the day went on, the noises grew closer, more deliberate. At one point, Eric stopped mid-swing with his hammer and turned to look into the trees. "Did you hear that?" he muttered under his breath. I hadn't heard anything, but the look on his face unsettled me. That night, as we sat around the fire, the woods seemed darker than before. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Every now and then we'd hear something, a faint crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. It felt like we were being watched, though none of us wanted to admit it. The next morning, we found footprints near our campsite. Not the kind you'd expect. These were human, barefoot. They circled our tents, weaving between the trees before disappearing into the woods. None of us said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. Someone had been here while we were sleeping. We decided to keep working, though our enthusiasm had waned. The idea of finishing the cabin felt less important than getting out of there as quickly as possible. We worked in silence, each of us glancing over our shoulders more often than before. By late afternoon, we had the walls framed and had started on the roof. The cabin was taking shape, but the sense of unease was growing. It was Eric who finally broke the silence. "We should leave tomorrow," he said. "We can come back later to finish." No one argued. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds outside. The footsteps returned, slower this time, deliberate. They circled the tents, paused, then moved toward the half-finished cabin. I wanted to get up, to look, but fear kept me frozen in place. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I drifted into a restless sleep. We woke at first light, packed our gear, and started the trek back to the trucks. None of us spoke much. We just wanted to get out of there. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I turned back for one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw it. Someone or something had added to our work. The walls were scratched, deep gouges running from the roofline to the ground. Inside, the floor was littered with feathers, small bones, and what looked like claw marks. It was as if the forest itself had rejected our presence. We didn't go back to finish the cabin. A few months later, Eric's cousin called to say he'd found the place burned to the ground. No explanation, no sign of who or what might have done it. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. All I know is that something in those woods didn't want us there, and I'm not sure if it ever left. It was 1998, and I was 29 years old. I had taken up night shifts to make ends meet after moving to a small town in Washington. My job wasn't glamorous. I was working as an on-site operator for a private security company. Most of my assignments involved patrolling remote locations, ensuring everything was locked and secure. I thought of it as easy money, though lonely. That night's assignment was at an old logging cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. The company contracted with a landowner who had stopped logging operations years ago. He was paranoid about trespassers or squatters damaging his property, so he paid for weekly checks on his abandoned cabin and equipment. I'd heard stories about the place from other operators, but nothing concrete, just vague warnings about keeping alert. I brushed it off as hazing for the new guy. The night was stormy, with heavy rain pelting the windshield of my company truck as I bounced along the muddy path leading to the cabin. The GPS signal had cut out a while ago, and my directions consisted of a photocopied map and some handwritten notes. I could barely see 5 feet ahead through the downpour. My high beams illuminated nothing but thick trees and endless rain. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin came into view. It was small, weather-beaten, and surrounded by overgrown vegetation. There was an old storage shed off to the side, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The entire area felt forgotten by time, a relic of a different era. I parked the truck close to the cabin and grabbed my flashlight and clipboard. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the mud sucked at my boots as I trudged toward the cabin. My first task was to do an external check, doors, windows, locks, before heading inside. I circled the cabin slowly, shining the flashlight on the wooden walls. The place looked intact. The windows were grimy but unbroken, and the door's heavy padlock was secure. As I moved toward the back, I noticed a pile of fresh cigarette butts on the ground, partially hidden by the rain. That was odd. This place was supposed to be abandoned, and my report from last week didn't mention anything unusual. The shed was my next stop. Its rusted metal door hung ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, the smell of damp wood and oil was overwhelming. Old tools and logging equipment were scattered across the floor, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here recently. I headed back to the cabin and unlocked the door with the key I'd been given. The interior was sparse. A small table, a couple of chairs, and a cot in the corner. There was a layer of dust on most surfaces, but the cot looked like it had been disturbed. The blanket was crumpled, and the pillow had an indentation, as if someone had used it recently. My pulse quickened. I documented everything on my clipboard, noting the cigarette butts, the open shed door, and the disturbed cot. This was enough to flag the site as compromised, and I'd have to report it to my supervisor. But protocol required me to complete the full inspection before leaving. I moved methodically, checking every corner of the cabin. There was an old wood-burning stove in the corner, its door slightly ajar. Inside, I found the charred remains of paper. Someone had burned something recently. I couldn't tell what it was, but the edges of one piece still had faint writing. It looked like coordinates, but the rain had smudged most of it. The sound of rain pounding on the roof was deafening, and every creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my boots set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint noise, like a muffled thud, coming from the shed. I froze, flashlight in hand, straining to hear over the rain. Another thud, this time louder. Someone or something was in the shed. I debated my options. I could leave now, call it in, and let the company handle it. But the thought of leaving without completing my inspection felt like a failure. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through my jacket almost instantly. The flashlight beam wavered as I made my way to the shed. The door was still ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, illuminating tools and machinery. Then I saw it, a pair of muddy boots peeking out from behind a stack of crates. I backed out slowly, my heart pounding. Whoever was hiding in the shed hadn't moved, but I couldn't take any chances. I made my way back to the truck as quickly as I could, slipping and sliding in the mud. Once inside, I locked the doors and reached for the radio to call my supervisor. But the radio was dead. Panic set in. The storm must have knocked out the signal, leaving me completely cut off. My only option was to leave and report everything in person. I started the engine and turned the truck around, but as my headlights swept across the cabin, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. They were tall, wearing a hooded jacket, and holding something in their hand. I couldn't make out any details through the rain, but the sight was enough to send me into overdrive. I floored the gas pedal, the truck fishtailing as I sped back down the muddy trail. The drive back felt like an eternity. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the main road, I drove straight to the company's office. I was soaking wet, covered in mud, and shaking as I recounted everything to my supervisor. He listened quietly, then told me to go home and rest. The next day, I learned the company had sent a team to investigate the cabin. They found evidence of someone living there, food wrappers, more cigarette butts, and a makeshift bed in the shed. But the person was gone. I quit the job a week later. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse. To this day, I don't know who was at that cabin or what they were doing there. But sometimes, on stormy nights, I still think about those muddy boots and the figure in the doorway, wondering how close I came to being their next target. It was late September when my friend Eric invited me to his grandma's old farm cabin for a weekend. I had nothing better to do, and I figured the fresh air and quiet would be a nice change from the city. Eric had been talking about the place for years, how it had been in his family for generations, and how his grandma finally passed it down to him after she moved to a retirement home. He warned me that it was pretty isolated and that cell service was non-existent, but that didn't bother me much. The cabin was in northern Minnesota, nestled deep in a patch of woods near a wide open field. It was about a 3-hour drive from the city, and the roads got progressively worse the closer we got. Gravel turned to dirt, and the overgrown trees almost seemed to swallow the car as we made our way along the final stretch. Eric joked about how the cabin was probably still full of old junk from the 60s, and I laughed, though something about the area already felt a little off. When we finally arrived, the place looked as rundown as Eric had described. The cabin was small, with faded wooden planks and a sagging roof. There was a rickety porch out front with a single rocking chair and a pile of chopped firewood that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Surrounding the cabin were acres of untamed fields, with the woods looming just beyond. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. The furniture was outdated, and the wallpaper was peeling in places. There were a few personal touches, family photos, a quilt draped over the couch, but everything else screamed neglect. Still, it had its charm, and I could see why Eric was so fond of it. We spent the first day cleaning up and unpacking. Eric wanted to clear out the attic, which was full of old boxes and furniture his grandma had left behind. While he tackled that, I decided to explore the property. I wandered around the field, noting the old barn about 100 yards from the cabin. Its doors were slightly ajar, and the roof had partially caved in. I didn't go inside, though. Something about the barn gave me a bad feeling, like it had been forgotten for a reason. That night, we built a fire in the cabin's small fireplace and cooked some canned food Eric had brought. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the whole cabin creak. I joked about how we were probably living in a horror movie, but Eric just laughed it off. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It sounded like something scratching against the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was too deliberate. Scratch, pause, scratch. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the sound was unsettling. I didn't want to wake Eric, so I stayed in bed, listening. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped, and everything went quiet again. The next morning, I told Eric about the noise. He shrugged it off, saying animals were common out here. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. We spent the day outside, exploring the woods and checking out the old barn. Eric finally convinced me to go inside. The place was a mess. Broken tools, rusty farming equipment, and piles of hay covered the floor. There was a loft above, but the ladder leading up to it was missing a few rungs. Eric climbed up anyway and found a pile of old hunting gear and a dusty mattress. What kind of animals lived here? I asked, trying to sound casual. Eric just shrugged again. That night, the scratching returned, but this time it was louder. I woke Eric up, and we both listened as the noise moved from one side of the cabin to the other. It wasn't random. It sounded like something was circling the cabin, deliberately dragging its claws along the walls. Eric grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check. I stayed behind, too nervous to follow. A few minutes later, he came back, shaking his head. He didn't see anything, but he looked just as uneasy as I felt. The next day, we decided to set up some traps around the property. Eric had a few old ones in the barn, and we placed them near the edges of the field and around the cabin. We spent the rest of the day trying to distract ourselves, but the tension was palpable. That night, the scratching started earlier, just after sundown. This time, it was accompanied by a low, guttural growl. My heart was pounding as I stared at the window, half expecting something to burst through. Eric grabbed his flashlight and a baseball bat, and we went outside together. The growling stopped as soon as we stepped onto the porch. The traps were untouched, and there was no sign of anything unusual. We walked around the cabin, shining the flashlight into the woods, but all we saw were shadows. When we went back inside, we locked all the doors and windows. Eric pulled out an old hunting rifle his grandpa had left behind, just in case. Neither of us slept much that night. The next morning, we found something near the barn. A dead rabbit, its body torn apart. The traps hadn't caught anything, but there were strange marks in the dirt, like claw prints but larger than any animal I'd ever seen. Eric tried to downplay it, saying it was probably just a coyote, but I could tell he didn't believe it. That afternoon, the weather took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up, making the cabin feel even more isolated. We decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, keeping the rifle close by. As night fell, the scratching returned, but this time it was on the roof. We could hear it moving above us, slow and deliberate. Eric aimed the rifle at the ceiling, his hands shaking. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. We stayed up all night, listening to every creak and groan the cabin made. The storm raged outside, and the wind howled like a living thing. When morning finally came, we decided we'd had enough. We packed our things and left, driving back to the city without saying much. Eric later told me he planned to sell the cabin, and I didn't blame him. I still think about that weekend sometimes, especially at night when everything is quiet. I'll never know what was out there in the woods, but whatever it was, it wanted us to know it was there. I'm not sure why I thought it was a good idea to stay at a cabin near an old, overgrown graveyard. I guess I was chasing that rustic getaway vibe people romanticize about. It was 1998, and I had just turned 32. Work had been grinding me down, and I wanted to escape the noise of the city. A coworker, Dale, mentioned a secluded cabin he owned in southern Tennessee, deep in the woods near the edge of a forgotten cemetery. He said it hadn't been used in years, but would suit someone looking for peace and quiet. That sold me. The drive there was uneventful. The narrow dirt road leading to the cabin wound through dense trees, the kind that seemed to press closer the farther you drove. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the woods in long shadows. The cabin was small and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it looked sturdy enough. Behind the cabin, maybe 50 yards out, was the graveyard. Dale hadn't exaggerated when he said it was neglected. Rusted iron gates hung crookedly on their hinges, and weeds and bushes had swallowed most of the headstones. From what little I could make out, the dates carved into the stones were from the 1800s. It was eerie, sure, but in a way it added to the charm of the place. I figured I'd leave it alone and focus on relaxing. The first night was uneventful. The cabin was sparse but functional: an old wood-burning stove, a small cot, and a few pieces of mismatched furniture. I spent the evening unpacking and reading by lantern light since there wasn't any electricity. I heard the usual forest sounds: crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The graveyard didn't bother me. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The woods were dense but beautiful. As I wandered, I noticed how quiet it was, almost unnaturally so. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how isolated you are. I didn't go near the graveyard until late afternoon. Curiosity got the better of me. Most of the graves were too weathered to read, but a few names and dates were still visible. One grave stood out: a large, cracked headstone near the center with the name William Harper and the date 1871. The inscription below read, "Gone but not forgotten." Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I returned to the cabin and made a simple dinner. As the sun set, the woods seemed to grow darker than the night before, and the quiet felt heavier. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like something scraping against wood. My first thought was a raccoon or some other animal. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought and checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sound continued, closer this time. I followed the noise to the back of the cabin, where the graveyard loomed just beyond the trees. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the old iron gate. It was swinging slightly, creaking on its rusty hinges. The wind, I thought, though the air felt still. I convinced myself it was nothing and went back inside. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't paranoia, exactly, but an awareness, like being watched. I tried to distract myself with hiking and chopping firewood, but my eyes kept drifting to the graveyard. Around midday, I noticed something odd. The gate, which had been slightly ajar the night before, was now wide open. I hadn't touched it, and there hadn't been any wind strong enough to move it that far. That evening, I stayed inside, keeping the lantern burning longer than usual. I read until my eyes grew heavy and eventually fell asleep. I woke up abruptly, my heart pounding. It took me a moment to realize why. I'd heard something loud, like wood snapping. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously opened the cabin door. The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels oppressive. I scanned the yard and saw it. A tree branch, large and splintered, lying across the path leading to the graveyard. It hadn't been there earlier. I shone the light toward the graveyard and froze. Something moved. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but it was too tall, too upright. It was just a silhouette, barely visible among the headstones. I stood there, rooted in place, watching as it slowly disappeared deeper into the graveyard. I locked the cabin door and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was planning to pack up and leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what I'd seen. I walked to the graveyard, sticking to the edge. The gate was still open, creaking softly. As I stepped inside, I noticed something new. A fresh pile of dirt near William Harper's grave. It wasn't a full grave, more like someone had been digging and stopped halfway. My stomach turned. I backed away, ready to leave, when I saw something glinting in the dirt. Against my better judgment, I moved closer and picked it up. It was a rusted pocket watch, the kind with a hinged cover. Inside was an engraving, "To William, with love." I dropped it and ran back to the cabin. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe someone else had been here, vandals or kids messing around. But why? And why now? As night fell, the sense of unease grew unbearable. The woods were silent again, but it felt different this time. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead. Then came the sound. It started as a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. It grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone pounding on the walls of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and shouted, "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The pounding stopped. Then, from the back of the cabin, I heard the unmistakable sound of the iron gate creaking. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, heart racing. Minutes passed, then hours, until finally, the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things and loaded them into the car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the graveyard. The gate was closed, and standing just inside, barely visible, was a figure. It didn't move. It didn't follow. But I'll never forget the feeling it left me with, that I had been somewhere I didn't belong, and whatever was there wanted to make sure I knew it. I never went back to that cabin, and I never spoke to Dale about it. Some places are meant to be left alone, their stories buried with the dead. It was early November when my team and I decided to rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains for the weekend. The idea was to disconnect from our busy lives and enjoy the quiet of nature. There were 6 of us, all co-workers, and my dog, Cooper, a 3-year-old German Shepherd. We were all in our early 30s, working in the same office, and needed a break from endless deadlines and meetings. The cabin we picked was far from civilization, secluded enough that we'd have no cell service, which was part of the charm. We left early on a Friday morning, driving through winding roads surrounded by towering trees. By mid-afternoon, we arrived at the cabin. It was beautiful, rustic but sturdy, with a large stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and windows that looked out onto a dense forest. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and damp earth. As we unloaded the cars, Cooper darted around, sniffing every inch of the property. His tail wagged with excitement, but he occasionally froze, ears perked up, staring into the trees. I chalked it up to the unfamiliar smells of wildlife. The first evening passed uneventfully. We built a fire, grilled some food, and shared stories over drinks. The darkness outside was absolute, the kind that city dwellers like us weren't used to. It swallowed everything beyond the porch lights. Even with a flashlight, the forest felt like a wall of shadows. The next morning, I woke early and took Cooper for a walk. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds sang, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my boots crunching leaves. Cooper was unusually tense, sticking close to my side. When I stopped to let him sniff a tree, he growled low, staring into the distance. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I decided to cut the walk short. Back at the cabin, the rest of the group was up, cooking breakfast. I didn't mention the strange feeling. I didn't want to seem paranoid. We spent the day hiking, taking photos, and enjoying the fresh air. Cooper stayed close to me, his usual playful energy replaced by alertness. As the sun dipped low, we headed back to the cabin. One of my teammates, Aaron, joked about how quiet the woods were. "Not even a squirrel," he said. It wasn't funny. The silence felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, we lit the fireplace and settled in for board games. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Cooper lay by my feet, his ears twitching with every sound. Around midnight, everyone headed to bed. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, so we paired up. I took the couch in the living room with Cooper. I woke to Cooper growling. The fire had died down, leaving the room dimly lit by embers. He was standing by the window, his body rigid, ears forward. I sat up, my heart pounding. The wind had stopped. The silence was back, heavier than before. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any noise. Then I heard it, a faint crunch, like a footstep on leaves. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it outside. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing. Cooper didn't relax. His growl deepened, his teeth bared. I debated waking the others but decided against it. Instead, I locked all the doors and windows and kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife within reach. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, Cooper still standing guard. The next morning, I told the group what had happened. They brushed it off as an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. I wasn't convinced. Cooper's reaction wasn't normal, and neither was the sound. After breakfast, we found something strange. About 20 yards from the cabin, in a patch of mud, were footprints. They were human but barefoot and larger than any of ours. They led from the woods toward the cabin and then veered off, disappearing into the trees. No one admitted to walking outside during the night. We were all unsettled but tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker had wandered too close, lost and disoriented. Still, we decided to keep closer together for the rest of the day. Cooper stayed on edge, sniffing the air and growling at nothing. His behavior was starting to make everyone nervous. By evening, the mood had shifted. We were all jumpy, glancing at the windows and double-checking the locks. The final night was the worst. We stayed up late, keeping the fire going and talking to pass the time. Around 2 a.m., we heard it, a loud thud on the porch. Everyone froze. Cooper was on his feet, barking furiously. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the front door. The porch was empty, but the thud was followed by another sound, scraping, like nails on wood. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find: fireplace pokers, kitchen knives, even a heavy flashlight. No one was brave enough to open the door. We stayed huddled together, listening as the noises continued. The scraping moved around the cabin from the front porch to the back. It was deliberate, slow, as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted us to know they were there. Cooper was frantic, barking and growling, his fur standing on end. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence was deafening. We didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, we packed up and left. Driving away, we felt a collective relief, like we were escaping something we didn't fully understand. When we reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station and told the clerk about our experience. She gave me a strange look and said, "You're not the first. People hear things out there all the time." I didn't press for details. I didn't want to know. To this day, I don't know what was out there or why it was circling our cabin. But I do know one thing: I won't be going back. Cooper still growls at dark windows, and I can't look into the woods without feeling that same chill, like someone or something is watching. It was late September when my boss, Claire, asked me to drive out to her family's cabin. Her mother had passed away unexpectedly, and Claire needed someone to retrieve some belongings from the property before the rest of her family came into town for the funeral. I'd never been to the cabin before, but she assured me it was a simple task: go up, collect some personal items, and come back. Claire and I didn't know each other well outside of work, but I respected her. She was the type of person who rarely showed vulnerability, so seeing her shaken by her mother's passing caught me off guard. That's probably why I agreed to help without hesitation. I thought it would be a chance to ease her burden, maybe prove my worth beyond the office. The cabin was a 4-hour drive away, tucked deep in the woods outside a small town called Silver Pines. It was one of those places where cell service vanished as soon as you left the highway. Claire warned me about the remoteness but promised that everything I needed would be straightforward. She handed me the keys, a handwritten list of items to collect, and a map. The drive itself was uneventful. The highway gave way to winding back roads, and soon I was surrounded by thick forests on either side. The further I drove, the narrower the road became until it was barely wide enough for my car. The trees pressed in close, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the late afternoon sunlight. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how isolated it was. There were no other homes in sight, just trees and the faint sound of a creek somewhere nearby. The cabin was old but well kept, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch. Claire's car wasn't there. She'd mentioned she wouldn't be joining me, but for some reason, I expected to see it. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. The air was cool and smelled like pine. There was something unnervingly quiet about the place. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. Shaking off the feeling, I grabbed the list and the keys and headed inside. The cabin's interior was cozy, with wood-paneled walls and a stone fireplace. It looked like the kind of place where someone might escape for a quiet weekend. But knowing the circumstances, it felt heavy, almost oppressive. I couldn't help but think about Claire's mother spending her final days here. I started with the list, It included personal items like photo albums, a jewelry box, and a collection of old letters. The first few items were easy to find, neatly packed away in the living room. As I worked, I noticed little details. Family photos on the walls, a worn quilt draped over the couch, a pair of reading glasses left on a side table. It all felt frozen in time, like Claire's mother had just stepped out and would be back any minute. By the time I moved to the bedroom, the sun was starting to set. The list mentioned a trunk at the foot of the bed, which held some of the more sentimental items. The bedroom was small but tidy, with a large window that looked out into the woods. I opened the trunk and began sorting through its contents. Old dresses, a stack of journals, and a box of letters tied with a ribbon. As I packed the items into a bag, I noticed something odd. One of the journals wasn't bound like the others. It was newer, with loose pages tucked inside. Curious, I opened it. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry. The entries were short, fragmented thoughts, but one caught my attention. He's been watching me from the woods. Every night, closer. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was just the ramblings of an older woman, maybe written during a moment of paranoia or confusion. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. By the time I finished packing, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the cabin was cloaked in darkness. I tried the light switch, but nothing happened. I remembered Claire mentioning the generator and headed outside to check it. The generator was in a shed about 50 feet from the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight from the car and made my way over. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow path. The trees seemed even taller at night, their branches reaching out like claws. The shed was unlocked, and I found the generator inside. Took a few tries, but I managed to get it running. The lights in the cabin flickered on, casting a warm glow through the windows. Relieved, I turned to head back, and that's when I saw it. First, I thought it was a shadow, but shadows don't move like that. About 20 yards away, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam, something was standing in the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and its shape was wrong, angular with long limbs that didn't seem to fit together. I froze. My brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move, but I felt its presence like a weight pressing down on me. Slowly, I backed away, keeping the flashlight trained on the spot. As I reached the cabin door, I glanced back. It was gone. Inside, I locked the door and closed the curtains, my hands shaking. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light or a tree casting an odd shadow. But deep down, I knew better. I sat in the living room, trying to calm my nerves. The bag of items was packed and ready to go, but I didn't feel safe leaving in the dark. The thought of walking back to the car, of stepping outside again, was unbearable. I decided to wait until morning. The hours crawled by. I kept the flashlight close, jumping at every sound. The cabin, once warm and inviting, now felt like a prison. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal entry, about what Claire's mother might have seen. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off in the armchair. I woke to a noise, a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass. My heart pounded as I scanned the room. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from the window. I didn't move, couldn't. My eyes were locked on the curtain, where the faint outline of a figure loomed. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its head nearly reached the top of the window. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, the tapping stopped. The figure stepped away from the window, disappearing into the night. I didn't wait for morning. Grabbing the bag and the flashlight, I bolted for the car. The forest was silent as I ran, every shadow feeling like a pair of eyes watching me. When I reached the car, I didn't look back. I started the engine and drove. The the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the narrow road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Claire thanked me the next day, but I didn't tell her what happened. I didn't tell anyone. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I think about the journal. I think about the words scrawled on those pages about the figure at the window, and I wonder if it's still out there watching.